8. SS Sultana. Built in Ohio during the early 1860s as the Civil War ravaged in the U.S., the commercial side-wheel steamboat SS Sultana was originally intended for use in the cotton trade along the lower Mississippi. During its first 2 years of service, it routinely traveled between St. Louis and New Orleans, often carrying Union troops in addition to cargo. The Sultana was small, measuring just 260 feet (79 meters) long, and 42 feet (12.8 meters) across at its widest point. It was legally allowed to carry 376 passengers, but more than 2,130 passengers crammed on board one day in 1865, including Union soldiers who had recently been released from Confederate prisons. That same day, something went wrong with one of the Sultana's boilers. Repairing it properly would take a few days, but the captain and chief engineer convinced the mechanic to do a patch job. The dangerously overloaded ferry struggled over the next few days as it fought to sail upriver during heavy spring flooding. While traveling a little north of the Memphis during the early morning hours, the Sultana's faulty boiler exploded. Between 400 and 500 passengers died instantly. 2 more explosions ensued, destroying the pilot house, collapsing part of the deck, and ripping a gaping hole in the steamer. Passengers clung to each other for dear life and screamed as loud as they could to get the attention of rescuers as they ended up in the frigid waters. The exact death toll is unknown, but it's estimated that 1,169 lives were lost. Around 760 passengers survived the initial sinking, although 31 of them died in the months following the ordeal. The sinking of the Sultana was the deadliest maritime disaster in U.S. history. Nobody was ever formally held responsible for the incident. Union officer Captain Frederick Speed was initially charged and found guilty of overcrowding the vessel, but his conviction was overturned. Captain Reuben Hatch, who had bribed the Sultana's captain to take on multiple times more passengers than the ship could safely handle, quit the military in a hurry to avoid a court-martial. The only other person at fault, Captain Mason, perished in the disaster. 7. USS Cyclops. Built in the years leading up to World War I, the USS Cyclops was designed as a bulk coal carrier called a collier. At nearly 550 feet, 168 meters long, it was the U.S. Navy's largest and fastest fuel ship at the time. One of its main duties during the war was to transport medical staff and supplies to a hospital in France. After the conflict, its 50 caliber guns were removed, and it began shuttling cargo back and forth from Brazil. The Cyclops left Rio de Janeiro on February 15, 1918, with a load of manganese ore. It was originally heading for Baltimore, but the captain requested a detour to Barbados, citing engine problems that he suspected were caused by carrying too much cargo. After leaving Barbados for the U.S., the Cyclops was never seen again. All 309 crew members disappeared along with it, without ever sending a distress signal. A massive search effort failed to find the vanished ship and sailors, and the vessel's fate and location remain a mystery to this day. No evidence of what may have happened to it has ever turned up. The disappearance of the crew is considered the greatest non-combat loss of lives in U.S. Navy history. There are many theories about what might have caused the Cyclops to vanish seemingly into thin air, including suspicions revolving around aliens, the Bermuda Triangle, German spies, sea monsters, and possible human culprits. Many have also speculated that the captain, George Worley, was an alcoholic who had no business being in charge of a ship. The crew may have encountered mechanical failures, or they may have been unfamiliar with how to handle the ship properly with a heavy load of manganese ore, which the Cyclops didn't normally carry. Sadly, there's a high likelihood that the lingering questions surrounding the bizarre tragedy will never be answered. 6. RMS Queen Elizabeth. After construction was completed during the late 1930s, the 1,031-foot-long RMS Queen Elizabeth held the record for the largest passenger steamship ever built. Named after the wife of King George VI, The luxury liner was initially docked in New York to protect it from German bombs during World War II, but it was eventually called to service as a troop transport ship. The hull was painted gray, and the ship was outfitted with multiple anti-aircraft guns. Throughout the conflict, the Queen Elizabeth ferried nearly 1 million Allied soldiers to Asia, Africa, and Europe. After the war ended, the vessel was converted back to a luxury cruise ship for the Cunard Company. It completed its last voyage for Cunard in 1968 and was subsequently sold to a businessman from Hong Kong named C.Y. Tung. He renamed the ship the Seawise University and sent it for refitting with plans to turn it into a floating college. In early 1969, someone deliberately set fire to the vessel while it was still undergoing repairs. The Seawise University was destroyed in the blaze and was dismantled for scrap. To this day, the arsonist's identity remains a mystery. Many were quick to suspect Young, the ship's owner, because he had insured it for more than he paid for it. Others suspected that the fire resulted from political differences between Young, who was a Chinese nationalist, and members from the country's largely nationalist shipbuilding unions. The unfortunate truth is that we'll most likely never know. Do you have any theories on who set fire to the Seawise University? Let us know in the comments below, and hit that subscribe button while you're at it. 5. RMS Lucitania. The 787-foot-long RMS Lucitania embarked on its maiden voyage from Queenstown, Ireland to Sandy Hook, New Jersey in 1907. At the time, it was the world's largest luxury ocean liner. During its heyday, wealthy passengers, average families, and travelers of limited means widely favored the Lusitania over other ships. First-class amenities were top-notch and spanned 2 entire decks, offering a lavish dining room, a smoking room, a reading and writing room, a lounge, a music area, and more. The ship's second-class accommodations were like a slightly less lavish version of first class. There weren't as many spaces and activities to choose from, and they weren't adorned with gilded wallpaper and other over-the-top decor, but the offerings were very comfortable. But the Lusitania made the most money from its third-class passengers, who found the amenities to be much nicer and more spacious than the conditions on other vessels. At the onset of World War I, many passenger ships canceled service for safety reasons. The Lusitania, on the other hand, received a drab gray paint job to make it less conspicuous and powered on. It continued to offer passengers service amid the increasing threat of German U-boats. While nearing the end of its 202nd transatlantic crossing on May 7, 1915, the Lusitania was struck by a torpedo off the Irish coast. The ship quickly began to founder and list, and it sank completely within 18 minutes of being hit, killing nearly 1,200 of the 1,962 passengers and crew members aboard. Civilians in the US and numerous other countries were outraged by the Germans' decision to sink a passenger ship, which marked a step towards America's eventual involvement in the war. The Germans defended the move and claimed no responsibility for the lives lost. 4. Zenobia. The Swedish-built ferry Zenobia began its maiden voyage from Sweden to Syria on May 4, 1980, with 104 cargo-filled tractor-trailers. While traveling from the Strait of Gibraltar to Athens, the captain encountered steering issues. The 571-foot-long, 174-meters ship soon began to list. Crew members discovered excess water in the ballast tanks and pumped it out. Assuming that the problem had been fixed, the vessel proceeded towards Cyprus. The Zenobia started listing again, and engineers determined that a software malfunction was to blame. Worried that the ship was a danger to other vessels, authorities ordered the captain to leave the harbor. The list worsened after the crew anchored offshore, giving them no choice but to abandon the ship. Witnesses would later claim that the crew calmly drank beer on the shore and watched the Zenobia sink as it took $200 million worth of cargo with it to the seafloor. Some people People thought that their unfazed behavior was strange, and they became suspicious when there was no investigation into the sinking. To make things even more bizarre, no insurance claim was ever filed, and nobody ever tried to salvage the cargo. Even the police became suspicious that the Zenobia was perhaps sabotaged and launched an investigation into the incident. Numerous theories about the shady sinking have been floated, including that British and Israeli intelligence destroyed the ship out of a fear that it was carrying guns for the Palestinian Liberation Organization. The truth behind what really happened may never be known, but people got at least one cool thing out of the sinking: one of the world's most popular diving sites. Sitting in Larnaca Harbor in crystal clear water at depths ranging from 50 to 140 feet, it can be seen from above the water and is famous for the array of dump trucks and other vehicles that are scattered around it. 3. USS Juno. The Sullivan brothers, George, Francis, Joseph, Madison, and Albert, insisted on serving on the same ship together during World War II, even though U.S. Navy policy forbade them from doing so. They refused to join the fight unless their request was honored, and the military relented and allowed it. The young men served on the 541-foot-long USS Juno, a light cruiser that participated in the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands in October 1942. A few weeks later, the ship fought in the Battle of Guadalcanal off the Solomon Islands and was struck by a Japanese torpedo. It broke in half and sank entirely in just 20 seconds or less. Crews in nearby ships presumed that there was no way anyone survived and left the area. They were unfortunately very wrong. At least 100 people survived the attack, but by the time rescue arrived 8 days later, all but 10 had died from shark attacks, dehydration, and exposure. Altogether, 687 sailors lost their lives. In 2018, a crew led by billionaire Paul Allen discovered the Juno wreck resting in several large pieces at the bottom of the South Pacific. It sits nearly 3 miles beneath the surface at a depth of 13,800 feet. 2. USS Plane View. The American Navy built its first hydrofoil ship, the USS Plane View, during the 1960s, measuring nearly 221 feet and 41 feet across at its widest point. It was the world's largest hydrofoil during its time. The Plane View was a prototype constructed for the express purpose of researching the usefulness and capabilities of hydrofoil vessels. Built by Lockheed, it was made from aluminum and powered by twin turbofan jet engines. Its design enabled it to glide 10 feet above the water's surface at speeds of up to 58 miles per hour. Unlike the Soviet Union, which really took the hydrofoil concept and ran with it, the US military's experimental phase with the boat didn't last very long. The Plane View was taken out of service in 1978 due to the high costs of developing and maintaining it. Commercial fisherman Lowell Stambaugh bought the boat with plans of turning it into a fishing vessel, but he gave up on the idea 10 years later. The scrapping process was started at some point but was never finished, and the Plane View has been left to deteriorate in Washington's Hungry Harbor. Environmental authorities have grown increasingly concerned in recent years about the pollution hazards it poses as the hull corrodes, which means it's likely just a matter of time before it starts to leak contaminants. The need to remove the Plane View from the water is urgent, but doing so is incredibly expensive. For now, it continues to languish with an uncertain future as an object that once drew curious onlookers, but has been reduced to little more than a rotting eyesore. 1. RMS Carpathia. The RMS Carpathia is famously known as the ship that answered the Titanic's distress call on the ill-fated night of April 14, 1912. Harold Cottam was working as the Carpathia's wireless operator when the Titanic's first distress calls went out. He was out on the bridge at the time, but he got the message later on. After not being taken seriously by several crew members, Cottam woke the Carpathia's captain up, and he ordered the crew to navigate full steam ahead to the Titanic's coordinates. The Carpathia arrived at the site 2 hours later. For more than 4 hours, the ship navigated the debris-strewn waters, pulling more than 700 survivors aboard. Both the passengers and crew aboard the Carpathia sprang into action to help any way they could, from plucking people from the water and lifeboats to comforting traumatized survivors. The 558-foot-long ship went on to serve in World War I as a troop transport vessel. It was torpedoed 3 times by a U-boat in 1918 and sank off the Irish coast. 5 out of the 166 crew and 57 passengers aboard lost their lives. The Carpathia wreck was located in 2000 at a depth of 500 feet. It's owned by Premier Exhibitions Incorporated, which owns more than 5,500 artifacts from the Titanic. The company plans to recover artifacts from the Carpathia for display in traveling exhibitions.
4. Goodwin Sands. One of the most dangerous stretches of sand in Britain is located 6 miles off the coast of Deal in East Kent, England. The dunes provide a significant obstacle to navigators since they're situated in the midst of the English Channel in the narrow Straits of Dover, close to one of the world's busiest shipping channels. More than 2,000 ships are said to have wrecked on Goodwin Sands since the first one was recorded in the year 1298. Under the surface, many wrecks are still present. Although the Goodwin Sands are roughly 10 miles long and 3 miles wide at its widest, the shoals are continually shifted by the currents and tides. For the majority of the time, the sand sits beneath the water at a depth between 26 and 49 feet. The sandbanks, however, break the surface as the tide recedes. When this happens, the sand becomes firm enough to walk on. Normally, a ship would run into the sand during choppy weather and would start to break apart. If you were to survive this, it's advised that you start a fire to attract passing ships in order to request assistance. Sadly, the sand turns into quicksand when the tide changes, devouring the ship and her crew if help doesn't come within a few hours. The Great Storm of 1703 had the worst death toll of any incident that's occurred here. A total of 2,168 people lost their lives when at least 40 commercial vessels and 13 men-of-war ships capsized in the Downs. Local divers stumbled upon the HMS Stirling Castle, one of the vessels that was lost that night, in 1979. An East India Company ship called the Admiral Gardner sank in January 1809 and is among the other noteworthy disasters that occurred in the Goodwin Sands. It was loaded with 48 tons of company coins, and the rest of its cargo consisted of iron, weapons, and anchors. Amazingly, around 1 million coins were collected from the wreckage by divers in 1984. With a 300-meter exclusion zone surrounding its wreck site, Admiral Gardner is now a protected area. Modern ships are now able to avoid the Goodwin Sands thanks to new cutting-edge navigational equipment, many of which are aided by GPS and comprehensive channel mapping. The last major accident to occur here was when a lightship capsized in 1954. 3. The Great Blue Hole. There's a sinkhole that's almost 400 feet deep in the Gulf of Aqaba. It's located north of the Red Sea and is situated between Dahab, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia. It's called the Blue Hole, and it's one of the most stunning yet dangerous diving locations in the world. The number of people who've died here isn't known, however, it's estimated to be around 200. Because of this, diving is prohibited in the Blue Hole unless you're an experienced and qualified diver. According to a handful of experts, some of the deaths that have occurred here are the direct result of the divers' overconfidence, and they say that the Great Blue Hole doesn't deserve a bad reputation. They reported that even the most advanced divers can make mistakes, and if one is made while in the Blue Hole, almost nothing can be done to save them. Some people believe that the Blue Hole shape plays a big role in the number of accidents that have been linked to it. Divers have often claimed to observe light emanating from a large tunnel located around 300 feet below the surface. Some divers have even made the mistake of swimming downward toward the light instead of upwards because they thought it was the sun on the surface of the water. Nitrogen narcosis can be a serious outcome because of this, a severe threat for divers. Even professional divers can't escape it, like Yuri Lipsky. His death was caught on camera, making it the most famous Blue Hole fatality of all time. Nitrogen narcosis is an effect that's created when a person inhales nitrogen under increased amounts of pressure. About 78% of every breath you take is made up of nitrogen, which generally passes through the body without having any obvious impact. But there's just one issue with that. Nitrogen and oxygen don't get absorbed by the body the same way. A person can't breathe underwater unless the water and air are at the same pressure. The air has to be 4 times as dense when you're 100 feet below the surface, and the consequences usually get worse the deeper you go. Lightheadedness, numbness, carefreeness, and even euphoria have been some of the reported symptoms of nitrogen narcosis. Unfortunately, these often lead to more serious symptoms, such as irrational behavior and slowed critical thinking. The type of water a diver is in typically affects what happens next for them, while those in colder, darker water frequently report experiencing dread and worry. Those in warm water describe feeling comfortable and calm. However, almost everyone has reported that the effects are similar to being intoxicated, no matter what the temperature of the water is. In order to prevent the effects of nitrogen narcosis, many divers opt to use helium during prolonged dives. It's a great substitute for nitrogen because it's another inert gas that doesn't absorb right away. The spectacular tunnel of the Great Blue Hole is situated 300 feet below the surface. But at 184 feet, just over halfway to the tunnel, oxygen may turn hazardous. It performs poorly under severe pressure and will rapidly harm the body. To dive that deep, a person needs a certain mixture of gases. Those who've faced problems with oxygen while diving have likely encountered the condition known as hyperoxia. This can result in disorientation, breathing problems, and nearsightedness. However, with the proper equipment, the chances of getting it are rare. It's only safe to dive into the blue hole if you've already taken the necessary precautions. The 2 most important things to remember before visiting this place is to prepare the right gas mix and to know how to adapt to increasing pressure underwater. Would you take the risk and dive into the Gulf of Acaba's Great Blue Hole? Let us know in the comments below, and while you're at it, hit that subscribe button. 2. Cape Horn. Cape Horn is notorious for being incredibly dangerous. But for many early explorers, it was the only way they could get from one hemisphere to the other. It's been long recognized as the only route around South America. Dutchman Willem Schouten was the first person to travel around Cape Horn in 1616. It's been called a few names throughout the years, such as the Dutch town of Horn, and in Chile, the Spanish refer to it as Cabo de Horno. The Drake Passage, a 500-mile-wide section of water that's notorious for its strong winds, chilly temperatures, and dramatic wave patterns, was used by the majority of explorers to round the Cape. Because it provides the maximum room for navigation despite the hazardous circumstances, the passage's width is what makes it so popular with travelers. The waters have taken the lives of several explorers and numerous ships over the years, as well as mariners with different levels of experience who've tried or attempted to complete this trek in the past. The Beagle Journey, on which renowned scientist Charles Darwin traveled, is one of the most well-known expeditions that's been reported. He too described the perilous route and dangerous conditions that are so often heard of in this stretch of water. Jean-François de Galop-Lapérouse embarked on a journey of exploring and mapping in 1785 that took him to South America's southernmost point. He was one of the fortunate sailors who survived the voyage at the time, and he went on to discover and chart a large portion of the globe, from the coast of North America to Russia and Japan. Unfortunately, he subsequently lost his life when his ship went down in the Pacific Ocean when he was returning from Australia. The perfect storm of maritime risks may be seen at Cape Horn. The icy waters and high winds frequently combine to create turbulent seas. The seabed's also rather peculiar. Over a short distance, it rises rapidly at South America's southernmost point, going from 13,200 feet to barely 330 feet. Massive breaking waves result frequently from this abrupt transition. As waves travel through the sea, their contact with the rising ocean floor creates drag, which speeds up the wave's upper half. As a result, the seas have become exceedingly choppy in this area. These turbulent waters, coupled with the strong westerly winds, make navigation through the Drake Passage and the Cape Islands extremely hazardous. Stray icebergs from Antarctica are another navigational risk that can be encountered in this stretch of water. Navigation around Cape Horn is exceedingly challenging due to the terrible loss of many lives and ships. But luckily, a newer, more secure route, the Panama Canal, was opened in 1914. Even though it hasn't been necessary since it was created, occasionally ships still navigate the waters off Cape Horn. 1. Broomway. Foulness Island, located on the estuary of River Roach in Essex, England, has been under military control for a very long time. The War Office initially built an artillery range on the island in the middle of the 19th century, and is currently operated by the Ministry of Defense for the testing of new weapons and ammunition. The island is perfect for this because it's situated far away from densely populated areas. This place is truly unique and is almost uninhabited. Very few people live here, but those who do share it with guided missile systems, explosive shells, and killer grenades. When they aren't dealing with the dangers of the island, the people living here plant peas, linseed, wheat, and barley. For a long period of time, Foulness Island was only accessible by ferry, or when the sea went out, a walk could be taken down the tidal flats of Maplin Sands. It's known as the Broomway, and many consider it to be the most dangerous path in Britain. It starts at a place called Wakering Stairs, and then it stretches its way east, heading straight into the sea. The direction changes to northeast after only 1,312 feet. Then, for roughly 5 miles, the path is directly aligned with the coast. After that, the Broomway heads to the tip of the island, an area known as Fisherman's Head. Most seem to have no issues on the walk if the weather is good. However, many experience the effects of the relentless incoming tides. The waters rush in so quickly, you'll have water up to your neck before you even know what's happening. Unfortunately, this has resulted in the loss of multiple lives. Although there's proof that Broomway was used 600 years ago, when Roman settlements were found on Foulness Island, there's speculation that it was used much further back than that. It's been said that it may date back to Anglo-Saxon times, but it was subsequently flooded thanks to coastal erosion. According to archaeological research, the Broomway was formerly strengthened with wooden hurdle work, at least in the southern part. To mark the Broomway on maps, broomsticks with their bristles facing upwards were placed in the mud. And interestingly enough, that's how the route got its name. When the tide would retreat, writer Herbert W. Tompkins wrote that the brooms would lift their heads and appear as a line of black dots. This helped potential travelers choose when to start their journey. One of the worst dangers along the Broomway is getting caught in an incoming tide. It's difficult to see the coast, so a traveler might easily become lost and wind up veering off the road if a storm comes through, or if the island is covered in thick fog. As a result, you risk getting stuck in mud or quicksand. There's a very small window of time to return to land before the tide comes in, which unfortunately makes death a possibility. The firing range on Foulness Island is where the other danger lies. The military is responsible for the large craters that are formed on Maplin Sands and the Thames estuary as a result of firing their artillery, which often explodes. After the tide comes in, it leaves behind soft mud that fills the craters and creates sinking sand pits. This poses a large risk because they can't be seen by the naked eye. If you walk into one, there's a possibility you might not walk out of it. The firing range also leaves exploded shells behind from time to time, which have the possibility of exploding at any time. In 1922, bridges and a road that connected the island to Wakering Stairs were built by the military. Taking the Broomway today isn't necessary. However, many people take the Doomway, as locals call it, to get to Foulness Island because they're looking for adventure. If you survived a plane crash and were stranded in the middle of the ocean, would you rather float on your back until help arrives, or would you try to swim to safety, even though you don't know which direction to go in?
Number 5. Relics on Kinman Island. On October 24, 1949, the Battle of Gunnington took place. The conflict saw 8,000 members of the People's Liberation Army fall to 40,000 members of the Chiang Kai-shek's army, ultimately halting the Communists' forward advance. The Kinman Islands were heavily entangled in the Cold War-era global politics throughout the next few decades. Kinman was frequently referred to as the West Berlin of Asia, since it was both on an ideological and military boundary. The Formosa Resolution, enacted by President Eisenhower and Congress in 1955, gave the United States the power to protect Taiwan and any other areas under ROC sovereignty, which included the island. Mao and the People's Liberation Army attacked Kinman during the two Taiwan Straits crisis between 1954 and 55 and in 1958, causing the death of 61 people and 2,000 destroyed homes. During the 1954-55 period, almost 60,000 rounds were fired on the island. As a subject of discussion in the second Nixon-Kennedy presidential debate of 1960, Kinman rose to the front of American politics. After the shelling stopped in 1960, the ROC reorganized the island as a Three Principles of the People model country, and the local military changed its strategies to put a greater emphasis on social and economic development among its civilians. Kinman wasn't actually demilitarized until 1992, when a civilian government was installed and commerce with the nearby city of Xiamen continued. Relics from a brutal past are found on Kinman County's white sand beaches, as harrowing reminders of past battles and current tensions with its neighbors over the Taiwan Strait. Anti-landing spears and abandoned tanks are seen from the island's coastline. Kinman's geographical closeness to Xiamen City serves as the historical border between Communist China and the democratic nation of Taiwan. It's only 6.2 miles away at its nearest point. In the middle of the 20th century, this small group of islands served as a significant battleground between the Chinese Communist Party and Chiang Kai-shek's Nationalist Party. It was established as a separate county in 1914 and has been under the control of Taiwan since 1928. First impressions may be deceiving, and Kinman's historical war sites and ongoing political unrest may indicate a boiling hostility. These symbols of battle, though, go beyond the memories of bloodshed and fear. Music events are held in abandoned military tunnels, not far from Kinman's fortified beaches. Local restaurants offer specialty drinks in the shape of grenade casings, and shops keep a regular supply of used ammo shells for tourists to purchase as a reminder of the island's bloody past. Despite the horrifying incidents that happened decades ago, Kinman County continues to transform its past from a source of grief to a workable, tourist-centric economic model that helps to celebrate, rather than regret, its military involvement. Number 4. Underground Project 131. In the late 1960s, as tensions on the Chinese-Russian border rose and the threat of nuclear war loomed, Mao Zedong ordered the construction of underground towns to protect from nuclear attack. One of the cities was labeled Project 131, a code name derived from the date it was started, January 31, 1969. Similar to Beijing's underground city, Project 131 was constructed under a hill in Hubei province to serve as a military command center and housing for the general public. Because of this, in addition to blast doors, the bunker held offices for Mao Zedong and Lin Biao, as well as military buildings, including a council chamber and a communications center. The site was also outfitted with housing, a school, a restaurant, and a store. The project was given to local Jianing resident and People's Liberation Army Chief of Staff General Huang Yongsheng. It came to a sudden halt in the summer of 1971, after almost 1,496 feet of tunnel had been dug out. Lin Biao, who was suspected of trying to overthrow the government, died in questionable circumstances, and General Yongsheng, who was allegedly involved in Bao's conspiracy, was then detained. Project 131 was unable to continue without a proper supervisor, and it stood abandoned for almost 10 years before being converted into a tourist attraction by local civil authorities back in 1981. Visitors can tour most of the site's abandoned and never-used structures, which now includes a hotel and a meeting center. Foreigners have recently been completely banned from entering. In the past, they were allowed to, but required to pay twice as much for admission than Chinese visitors. On the surface of the site is General Yongsheng's burial, a museum from the Mao era, and a garden of nicely potted plants. Would you explore an abandoned military base? Let us know in the comments and subscribe while you're there. Number 3. Sandy Hook Nike Launch Site. A fascinating treasure is hidden on a small sliver of densely forested land that juts out 6 miles from northern New Jersey's shore. It initially seems like an aircraft carrier's upper deck, A large concrete slab is encircled by an aging barbed wire fence and is covered in thick foliage. Embedded in the earth are faded yellow lines and what seem to be long rusted bay doors. The boundary is marked by outdated arc lighting and several loudspeakers. The site once served as one of the most top secret spots in the US. It is the Nike missile base called Fort Hancock. Today, the site is in shambles, but during the height of the Cold War, you couldn't get a single foot near it unless you wanted heavily armed men to shoot you on sight. The Nike missile was a surface-to-air weapon invented by Bell Telephone Laboratories. It was directed by radar along with a tracking computer. The first successful atomic bomb test by the Soviet Union and their construction of a ranged bomber that was capable of traveling up to 10,000 miles were what sparked the program's start in 1945. A nuclear Soviet aircraft suddenly became a serious and dangerous threat. The Nike missile served as a safeguard against other tragic attacks like Pearl Harbor. The site has long been the ideal strategic location for protecting access into New York Harbor due to its deep canal. The water flows beside it close enough to New York, yet far enough away to allow ship movement. The narrow split of land has been battled over since the days of the Revolutionary War and was once home to America's oldest lighthouse. During the American Civil War, Old Fort Hancock was upgraded, and in the 1890s, massive concrete cannon batteries and mortar pits were built to defend Manhattan. Theater, sports field, a row of opulent yellow brick mansions made up the garrison town where nearly 7,000 troops used to live. After World War II, the enormous camp was abandoned and later used as a Nike launch location under the code name NY-56. The Nikes, though, were no longer relevant by the 1970s. Intercontinental ballistic missile technology paved the way for a new kind of fear, a Soviet nuclear strike that didn't need airplanes. The Nike program was abandoned altogether after 1974's Strategic Arms Limitation Talks Accord because the ongoing conflict in Vietnam consumed the majority of the country's defense spending. Around 250 bases still exist in ruin across the United States. Those built on Army sites already in use were just deactivated. Some of them were sold to school districts or made into municipal yards because they were so close to big cities. Others were used privately and turned into paintballing locations. Some of them were made into houses. One facility in Virginia was even converted into a jail. Only a few are still fully intact today. Because the sites are relatively new, there is an issue with historic preservation. On the National Register of Historic Places, Cold War-era buildings aren't readily safeguarded. The Cold War Veterans Association and other volunteer organizations are the only ones making any attempts to protect the historic sites. Number 2. Kamchatka. The abandoned Kamchatka, a former submarine secret facility, is close to the Soviet military town of Bechevinka. The administrative hub of Kamchatka, Petropavlovsk-Kamchatsky, is about 75 miles away. The base was given the secret codename Petropavlovsk-Kamchatsky 54, as well as Bechevinka and Finval, thanks to its location on Bichevskaya Bay. The final two digits of the codename are the base's zip code, and the first two numbers indicate the nearest major city. The Kamchatka Peninsula is very hostile. It is so full of volcanoes and glaciers that it is more commonly referred to as Russia's land of fire and ice. Bichevskaya Bay proved to be the ideal spot for a secret submarine facility because Kamchatka can only be reached by boat, helicopter, or during the winter, heavy-duty snowmobile. In the 1960s, when the Cold War was at its height and ties between the US and Russia were weak, the Soviet military town and garrison were established. Submarines that traveled the northern sea route were the first to use the facility, but 12 submarines from the 182nd Submarine Battalion were later moved to Bechevinka in August of 1971. In accordance with standard Soviet practice, a village was established nearby for employees as well as military personnel and their families while the new military base was finished and submarines were deployed. Originally, the builders constructed many panel homes to live in while working, but these were later demolished. Submarine crews had access to a makeshift floating base. 8 residential structures eventually made up the settlement of Bechevinka. Based on the chronological order of their construction, each house in the city was assigned a number. A post office, grocery store, school, hostel, and kindergarten were also created. There was even an entertainment venue with enough room for an orchestra, but it was destroyed by a fire in 1987. The essential military facilities were built near the residential structures. Among these were a commander's office, barracks, storage spaces, and a boiler room, a diesel substation, and a fuel house. As an extra line of defense, the hills around Bechevinka were used. The defensive emplacements were tucked away among the hills, increasing their effectiveness. A supply ship visited the submarine base from Petropavlovsk-Kamchatka once every week. The ship was unloaded that evening, and the locals would have access to food and other necessities the next morning thanks to the grocery store on site. Mail delivery was also provided thanks to the ship. Since there was no contact or land transportation between Bechevinka and other cities, this boat served as the only conduit to the outside world. In case of emergency, a helicopter would fly in, bringing some officials with it to the garrison. The Kamchatka base, though, was not in use for very long. 5 years after the fall of the USSR in 1996, cost-cutting efforts led to the relocation of every submarine stationed here to another port. The garrison had been entirely decommissioned. Before leaving, the locals disconnected the city's water and electrical supplies. The unfired weapons that were hidden in the hills were left to rot. The buildings and structures were officially written off from the Ministry of Defense's financial records only 2 years later. The old Soviet military base is now regarded as a ghost town and an interesting tourist attraction. Number 1. Bunkers in Albania. Enver Hoxha, an Albanian communist ruler from the end of World War II, oversaw the construction of over 750,000 bunkers until his death in 1985. Hoxha was one of the most isolationist leaders to rule his country. After Stalin's death, Hoxha, who had initially been a Soviet ally, pronounced the USSR to be revisionist and anti-Marxist. Shortly after, all of the Warsaw Pact countries renounced their commitment to Albania. Hoxha then accepted China as an ally, a relationship that only lasted a few years until 1977. Afterwards, he made attempts to make Albania self-sufficient. Hoxha used his secret police to suppress any opposition while he was in charge of the nation and forbid both religion and international travel. The military received nearly 24% of the country's total budget, with much of that money going towards bunkers. The main engineer assured Hoxha that the prototype bunkers could resist tank attacks while they were being built in the 1950s. With the engineer still inside, Hoxha decided to test it. After the attack, when the engineer came out unharmed, mass manufacturing started. Hoxha constructed enough concrete and steel bunkers to ward against a massive army. He feared an attack from his former Soviet partners or NATO. They showed up everywhere, in settlements, farms, parks, cemeteries, and on beaches, spreading out like strange gray mushrooms from the slopes to the sea. For Albanians who constantly came into contact with them despite the fact that the enemy never showed up, they instilled an eerie sense of discomfort. The bunkers still leave a mark on the landscape decades after Hoxha's authoritarian government fell. Only those in need of refuge occupy the abandoned buildings, which are overrun by weeds. Only a few bunkers have been creatively transformed into hotels or homes by Albanians. Nearly every vista in Albania's 11,100 square miles of steep terrain is cluttered with them. The country is one of the poorest nations in Europe as a result of decades of communist isolation and unregulated capitalism. There is about 1 bunker for every 4 Albanians, and each one cost $860 to demolish. In order to destroy some of the bunkers that threatened the security of the civilians they were intended to protect, Chinese-made T-59 tanks were sent onto Albanian beaches in 2009. Thanks for watching. Which of these Cold War relics would you like to see in person? Let us know in the comments and be sure to subscribe.